keep working. That's what they told Jay Calderwood at 11:15 a.m. on June 5, 1976. The dam was leaking, small springs along the downstream face. Nothing unusual for a new dam during first fill, they said. 22 minutes later, Calderwood was operating his bulldozer on the dam's crest when he saw it. Not a spring, a geyser, 40 feet high, erupting from the toe 165 feet below him. The downstream face wasn't leaking anymore. It was dissolving. He had 3 minutes to back that cat off the dam before 80 billion gallons caught him. He made it. Barely. 2 other bulldozer operators working closer to the breach weren't so lucky. They'd need ropes to pull them to safety as their machines were swallowed whole. 2 miles downstream, 2 fishermen on an island would see an airplane pilot waving frantically at them. They'd wave back. Seconds later, a 30-foot wall of water would decide which one lived and which one died. An 8 months pregnant mother would drop her laundry basket mid-fold and grab her 4-year-old daughter. Minutes to get out. Maybe less. 11 people downstream didn't make it. But hundreds did. Thousands did. And that's because one man refused to wait for official permission to sound the alarm. And every single one of those deaths started 3 years earlier when excavators found a void in the bedrock. 18 inches wide, 20 feet long, depth unknown. They filled it with concrete and kept building. Every geologist said don't build here. Idaho's politicians said build it anyway. This is what happens when keep working meets physics. But before Calderwood's desperate 3-minute race, before the toe of the dam simply ceased to exist, we need to understand something critical about this disaster. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't even incompetence. This was a choice, multiple choices actually, made by people who knew better over the screaming objections of everyone who understood what was about to happen. And understanding those choices is what kept hundreds of people alive on June 5th, because one civil defense director understood that when geologists say don't build here, they mean it. His name was Kent Marler, and when the moment came, he would ignore every protocol in the book to save thousands of lives. First, let's understand what he was reading, what he knew, what made him prepared to break the rules when everyone else was saying keep working. Let's start where all survival stories really begin, not with the escape, with the warnings. The eastern Snake River Plain, southeastern Idaho, a flat, fertile valley that looks peaceful until you understand what's underneath. Basalt, rhyolite, volcanic ash flow tuff from the Yellowstone supervolcano's Huckleberry Ridge eruption. 2.1 million years ago, the ash fell hot, melted together, then cooled. As it cooled, the rock fractured extensively. Massive open voids formed, natural channels for water to flow. This is not bedrock. This is Swiss cheese made of lava. The Teton River flows through this geological nightmare. Drainage from the western slopes of the Teton Mountains and northeastern slopes of the Big Hole Mountains. Beautiful country. Terrible place for a dam. But the area needed water. Eastern Idaho had suffered severe drought in 1961, then severe flooding in 1962. The February 11th through 12th flood, when unseasonably warm weather and rain rapidly melted snowpacks and ice-jammed channels, raised peak flow to 7,000 cubic feet per second. Much of Sugar City and Rexburg went underwater. Local farmers wanted flood control. They wanted irrigation. They wanted hydroelectric power. The Bureau of Reclamation had been investigating dam sites in the area since 1932. 20 reservoir sites surveyed. Field investigations in the 30s and 40s. Most sites rejected due to unfavorable geological conditions or excessive cost per acre-foot of storage. Think about that for a moment. In the 1930s and 40s, when engineering standards were less stringent, when safety margins were thinner, when environmental concerns were non-existent, the Bureau of Reclamation surveyed the Teton site and said no. The rock said no then. It would say no louder later. But politicians don't listen to rock. October 1961. A reconnaissance report recommended detailed studies begin immediately on the lower division, including Teton Dam and Reservoir. March 1962. A report on the lower Teton division showed feasibility of the project. Feasibility. That word is doing a lot of work, because what it meant was technically possible to build. Not safe, not advisable, just possible. Meanwhile, geologists were already finding problems that would put J. Calderwood in that bulldozer 14 years later. Between 1961 and 1970, approximately 100 borings were taken at the site. Test cores drilled by engineers and geologists employed by the Bureau of Reclamation. The results were unambiguous. The canyon rock at the dam site was highly fissured and unstable, particularly on the right side facing the direction of flow. Long-term pump-in tests showed permeability rates of 165 to 460 gallons per minute. That's not a little bit permeable. That's a lot permeable. Water doesn't just seep through that rock. It flows, gushes, disappears into voids that go deeper than your equipment can measure. But Congress was already moving. September 7th, 1964, the act authorizing construction of the Lower Teton Division of the Teton Basin Project passed Congress. Purpose: storing water of the Teton River in eastern Idaho for supplemental and primary irrigation water, power production, flood control, and enhancement of fish and wildlife and recreation. Cost: approximately $100 million. The authorization came before the geological surveys were complete, before anyone fully understood what they were building on, before the rock could finish screaming. The rock would speak in a language impossible to ignore. The same language that would send J. Calderwood backing up that bulldozer at maximum speed 5 years later. But first, there were people who tried to stop this. People who understood. People who warned. People whose warnings would save hundreds of lives when the dam finally failed. September 27th, 1971. Trout Unlimited, the Sierra Club, the Idaho Environmental Council, and the Natural Resources Defense Council filed a lawsuit in Idaho District Court. Trout Unlimited versus Morton. They wanted to stop construction. The lawsuit questioned the project's justifications. They argued that damming a wild and scenic river would result in the destruction of its trout fishery and other wildlife habitat, and, quote, replace a unique resource with a vulgar one. The lawsuit questioned the economic return on the investment. They questioned the Bureau's compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act. And they questioned the geologic soundness of the dam's location. Geologist Robert Curry of the University of Montana, a Sierra Club advisor, examined the site. The valley of the Teton River was a fill valley, bedrock buried well below relatively weak sediment. As a reservoir fills with water, the water seeps into the sediment, which soaks it up like a sponge. This weakens the material on which the dam is founded. It can lead to failure. The ground on one side of the proposed dam was softer than the ground on the other. The structural implications of this difference were not carefully evaluated. Curry suggested this situation would lead to compaction of the softer material, which would in turn cause leakage and eventually could lead to failure. Geologist Marshall Corbett of Idaho State University examined the site independently. He would later serve as an expert witness at congressional hearings on the dam collapse. His assessment matched Curry's. Fill Valley, weak sediment, unsuitable for a dam. Corbett argued that outside experts should have veto powers on the site selection of dam projects. He claimed that, quote, government geologists have a self-interest in such projects that could be an impediment to objectivity. In other words, the Bureau of Reclamation wants to build dams. That's their job. That's their budget. That's their prestige. Asking them if they should build a dam is like asking a barber if you need a haircut. The U.S. Geological Survey investigated the area. 5 earthquakes had occurred within 30 miles of the dam site in the previous 5 years, 2 of significant magnitude. The area was seismically active. The USGS provided this information to the Bureau of Reclamation in a memorandum. But here's where it gets interesting. The geologists' concerns were considerably watered down in the 6-month redrafting process before the USGS sent the final version to the Bureau in July 1973. Watered down, bureaucratic language for, we told you the truth, but then we changed it so we could ignore it. Meanwhile, one USGS geologist refused to water anything down, and his refusal would become the most chilling piece of prophecy in American engineering history. More importantly, his prophecy would be read by the one man who could act on it when the time came. December 1972. USGS geologist David Schleicher wrote about Teton Dam while it was still under construction. His exact words, "A final point is that flooding in response to seismic or other failure of the dam, probably most likely at the time of highest water, would make the flood of February 1962 look like small potatoes. Since such a flood could be anticipated, we might consider a series of strategically placed motion picture cameras to document the process." Read that again. A government geologist suggesting they set up cameras to film the failure. Not if it fails, when. That's not a warning. That's prophecy. And that prophecy gave Kent Marler, Operations Director for Madison County Civil Defense, the conviction to ignore official protocols and sound the alarm when the time came. Because he'd read Schleicher's memo. He knew what could be anticipated meant. The lawsuit raised all these concerns: geological unsuitability, seismic activity, environmental destruction, economic questionability. Concerns over the seismic conditions of the dam site delayed the bid process pending further review by the Department of the Interior. Then, Idaho's congressional delegation stepped in. Senator Frank Church, Senator James McClure, Representative Orville Hanson. They pressured the Department of the Interior to end the review and proceed with construction. The project meant jobs, federal money, political capital. The review ended. Construction began. August 1st, 1972. The contract was awarded. Morrison, Knutson Company and Associates would build the dam. Budget, approximately $100 million. Timeline, 4 years. The design called for an earth-fill dam. No concrete, just compacted earth and rock. 305 feet high, 3,050 feet long, 1,700,000 cubic yards of embankment material. It would be the 17th highest dam in the United States when completed. It would last exactly 8 months and 29 days after first fill began. Construction started in October 1972. Immediately, the problems began. The same problems the geologists had warned about. The foundation excavation revealed what the core samples had shown: highly fractured rhyolite bedrock, fissures, voids, open channels where water could flow freely. And when that water finally flowed, it would move through the canyon at terrifying speed. 30 feet high, fast enough to give 2 fishermen on an island only seconds to decide: jump in the river or hesitate. One choice meant life. The other meant death. The void. 1.5 feet wide, 20 feet long, depth unknown. The excavation equipment couldn't determine how deep it went. The engineers tried measuring. The void just kept going. Down into the fractured volcanic rock, into channels that connected to other channels, into a three-dimensional maze of open space beneath what was supposed to be solid bedrock. They filled it with concrete. But that wasn't the only void. As excavation continued, they found more. Smaller ones, larger ones, all interconnected through the fractured rock. The grouting program began, pumping cement slurry into the fractured rock to fill the voids and create an impermeable barrier. The program consumed twice as much grout as anticipated. The rock just kept swallowing it. Grout disappearing into fissures that led to voids, that led to channels, that led deeper into the geological nightmare. Meanwhile, the fill material presented its own problems. The design specified using wind-blown silt from the reservoir area as core material. Fine-grained aeolian sediment, easy to work with, readily available. But fine-grained silt has a problem. It's difficult to compact properly. And if it's not compacted to maximum density at optimum moisture content, it remains permeable. Water can move through it, slowly at first, then faster as the movement creates channels, then catastrophically as the channels erode into pipes. The specifications required compaction to 95% of maximum density. Field tests would later show significant areas achieved only 90 to 92%. The material was also too dry. Compaction at below optimum moisture content creates a material that looks solid but contains microscopic voids. When water enters those voids under pressure, the material can collapse. Construction continued through 1973 and 74. The dam rose, 305 feet high. A massive wedge of earth and rock stretched across the canyon. On the surface, it looked solid, impressive, a triumph of engineering. Underneath, in the fractured bedrock and improperly compacted fill, physics was waiting. October 1975, the dam was complete, ready for first fill. But there was a problem with the design that would prove critical. The dam had no low-level outlet works, no way to drain the reservoir quickly in an emergency. The only outlets were the river outlet works at mid-height and the spillway at the top. This meant that once filling began, there was no way to rapidly lower the water level if problems developed. You can slow the fill rate. You could stop filling. But you couldn't quickly reduce the pressure on the dam. And pressure was everything. Meanwhile, there was another critical design decision that would determine who lived and who died on June 5th. No instrumentation for monitoring the dam during first fill. No piezometers to measure water pressure within the dam. No settlement monuments to track movement. No seepage weirs to quantify leakage. The project construction engineer would later explain that continuous monitoring was not considered necessary because the dam was expected to perform satisfactorily. Expected. That word again. Doing a lot of work. So when filling began, there was no way to know what was happening inside the dam. No warning system, no data. Just visual observation of the downstream face. If you could see it, you knew about it. If you couldn't see it, it was happening anyway. February 3rd, 1976. Filling began. The plan called for gradual filling over several months. Slow rise to allow the dam to adjust to the increasing load. Time for any problems to reveal themselves. Time to respond. The reservoir rose steadily through February, through March, through April, through May. Everything looked fine. On the surface. June 3rd, 1976. The reservoir elevation reached 5,322 feet. The water was now approximately 260 feet deep at the dam. The pressure on the toe of the dam was immense. Millions of tons of water pressing against the downstream face, pressing into any crack, any fissure, any improperly compacted zone. And somewhere in the right abutment, in the fractured rhyolite bedrock that the geologists had warned about, in the voids they had tried to grout, in the channels that connected to other channels, water was moving. Not flowing yet, seeping, finding paths through the rock, through the grout, through the microscopic voids in the too dry, under-compacted fill material. June 4th, small wet spots appeared on the downstream face, not unusual for first fill. Moisture migrating through the embankment, normal seepage. The wet spots grew slightly larger overnight. June 5th, 7 a.m. Bureau of Reclamation personnel inspected the downstream face. The wet spots were still there, slightly larger, but nothing alarming. Just seepage, normal for a new dam. In a few hours, everything would change. 9:30 a.m. The project construction engineer examined the seepage areas. He determined that an emergency situation was not imminent and was concerned about causing undue panic. Not imminent. That assessment would be proven catastrophically wrong in 2 hours and 7 minutes. But it was enough to keep the construction crews working, including Jay Calderwood on his bulldozer on the dam's crest. 11:15 a.m. The wet spots were now small springs. Clear water flowing from several points on the downstream face. The flow rate was increasing. Some crew members were getting nervous. This didn't look like normal seepage anymore. Supervisors assured them it was fine. Keep working. First fill always produces some seepage. Nothing to worry about. Jay Calderwood kept working, grading the crest, moving earth. His bulldozer rumbling along the top of the dam. 165 feet above the toe. He didn't know that in minutes, he'd be in a race against physics. 11:37 a.m. He saw it. Not a spring. A geyser. Water erupting from the toe of the dam, shooting 40 feet into the air. Muddy water. Brown water. Water carrying sediment. That's when he knew. When everyone knew. Clear water seeping through is one thing. Muddy water erupting is something else entirely. Muddy water means the water is eroding material, carrying away the dam, creating channels, pipes, voids. The downstream face wasn't leaking anymore. It was dissolving, and Jay Calderwood was standing on top of it. Later, he would describe what he saw. The geyser growing larger, the water flow increasing, the toe of the dam beginning to slump, material sliding away, the erosion accelerating. He put the bulldozer in reverse. Not a panicked scramble, a deliberate action. He was a professional equipment operator. He knew his machine. He knew how fast it could move. He knew the distance to safety. He did the math in his head. The cat could back up at maybe 4 miles per hour. The dam's crest was 3,050 feet long. He was roughly in the middle. That meant 1,500 feet to solid ground. At 4 miles per hour, that's about 4.5 minutes. Behind him, the geyser was now a waterfall. A curtain of water and mud cascading down the downstream face. The toe was collapsing. The erosion was accelerating up the face, eating through the embankment. He didn't have 4.5 minutes. He backed up as fast as the cat would go, watching the erosion in his mirrors, watching the dam die beneath him. The other crew members were running, on foot, sprinting for the abutments, abandoning equipment, abandoning everything. Calderwood stayed in the bulldozer. It was faster than running. And if the dam went while he was on it, being in the cab gave him a chance. A small chance, but a chance. Not everyone made that choice. Two other bulldozer operators, working closer to the breach, stayed with their machines too long. The widening gap was swallowing everything. Their dozers, the ground beneath them, the entire section of dam. They were caught in the eroding embankment, trapped, the machines sinking into the collapsing face. Other crew members grabbed ropes, threw them to the operators, pulled them to safety as their bulldozers disappeared into the breach. That's how close it was. That's how thin the margin between Calderwood backing up in time and those two operators needing rescue. Seconds, maybe a minute. The difference between reversing away and being swallowed. The erosion was visible now, even from the crest. A massive hole forming in the downstream face, growing larger, growing faster. The water pressure finding every weakness, every fissure, every undercompacted zone. Physics was speaking, loudly. 11:40 a.m. Calderwood's bulldozer reached the left abutment. Solid ground. He kept backing up. Another 100 feet, 200 feet. Away from the edge, away from the collapse. He stopped, shut down the cat, got out, and watched. The two rescued operators reached solid ground moments later, soaking wet, covered in mud, shaking. Their dozers were already gone, swallowed by the breach, buried under millions of gallons of water. 3 bulldozer operators had been working on that dam. All 3 survived. But it was close, rope rescue close. The hole in the downstream face was now enormous, 100 feet wide, growing every second, water pouring through. The crest began to sag, the top of the dam settling as the material below was washed away. 11:57 a.m. The crest failed. A section approximately 50 feet wide collapsed into the growing breach. The water now had a path straight through the dam, from reservoir to downstream. The erosion accelerated catastrophically. Within minutes, the breach was 200 feet wide. The water flowing through is carving the breach larger. Vertical walls collapsing, material washing away. The breach growing both wider and deeper. 12:10 p.m. The breach reached the reservoir level. The full head of water now flowing through. 260 feet of water pressure driving the erosion. The discharge rate was staggering. Estimates would later calculate 65,000 cubic feet per second. More than 9 times the peak flow of the 1962 flood, and increasing. By 12:30 p.m., the breach was over 300 feet wide. The flow rate exceeded 100,000 cubic feet per second. At 1 p.m., the flow rate peaked. Estimates range from 1 million to 2 million cubic feet per second. The uncertainty reflects the fact that no one had ever seen anything like this. No instruments could measure it. No models could predict it. The fastest moving water ever recorded from a dam failure. Faster than Johnstown. Faster than St. Francis. Faster than anything. And that water was heading downstream, toward Sugar City, toward Rexburg, toward 11,000 people. But here's where the story of ignored warnings becomes the story of heeded warnings. Because while the Bureau of Reclamation was saying everything's fine, one man was preparing to ignore every protocol in the book. Kent Marler, Operations Director for Madison County Civil Defense. He'd read David Schleicher's memo, the one about setting up cameras to film the anticipated failure. He knew what the geologists had said. He knew the dam was built on fractured volcanic rock. He knew what could happen. So he'd been watching, monitoring, preparing. When the first reports of unusual seepage came in at 11:15 a.m., he didn't wait for official declarations. He didn't wait for the Bureau of Reclamation to determine if the situation was imminent. He picked up the phone. 11:45 a.m. Marler called the Rexburg police dispatcher. Unofficial warning. The dam is experiencing problems. Be ready to evacuate. The dispatcher, Beverly Barkdale, understood. She'd lived through the '62 flood. She knew what the Teton River could do. She began alerting emergency services. 12 noon. The dam's crest collapsed. Marler got the call. He didn't wait for official authorization. He activated the emergency broadcast system. Attention! This is an emergency. Teton Dam has failed. Evacuate immediately. Move to higher ground. This is not a drill. Teton Dam has failed. The warning went out over radio, over television, through the emergency broadcast system, every station, every frequency, and people heard it. Because it was noon on a Saturday, people were home, radios were on, TVs were on, the warning reached them. But hearing the warning and surviving the flood were two different things. Some people had 20 minutes, some had 10, some had 5, and some had seconds. In Sugar City, families heard the warning and immediately headed for higher ground. No hesitation, no debate. They'd been through floods before. They knew you don't question the warning, you move. In Rexburg, Rick's college students heard the warning in their dorm rooms. They ran. Some grabbed a few possessions. Most just ran. Throughout the valley, 11,000 people heard the warning and moved. Rochelle Marks was 4 years old. She would remember this moment for the rest of her life. The image burned into her brain with the clarity that only childhood trauma provides. Her mother, 8 months pregnant, doing laundry in their home. The radio warning came through. Teton Dam has failed. Evacuate immediately. Her mother didn't freeze, didn't debate, didn't question. She started frantically stuffing laundry back into the basket. Not because the laundry mattered, because her hands needed something to do while her brain processed what was coming. Then she stopped, dropped the basket, grabbed Lachelle. Get out, now. Water is coming. We need to get out now. They made it to higher ground, minutes before the water arrived. Rochelle Marks, decades later, still sees it. Her 8 months pregnant mother, the laundry basket, the frantic stuffing, the moment when survival instinct overrode everything else. That decision is why hundreds survived instead of dying. But not everyone had enough time. Darryl Wayne Grigg and David Benson were fishing on a small island in the river, 2 miles downstream from the dam, a spot they'd visited many times before. They'd just set foot on the island when they noticed an airplane flying low overhead. The pilot was waving at them, frantically. They didn't recognize him, but figured maybe they knew him. They waved back. Suddenly, the river rose by 6 feet in seconds. Grigg looked upstream. A 30-foot-tall wall of water was crashing down the canyon toward them. Not 4 to 6 feet like it would be when it spread across the plain. 30 feet, a vertical wall, confined by the canyon, moving at incredible speed. Grigg turned and yelled at David, telling him to jump in the river, swim. That's what Grigg did. Dove into the water, let the current take him, use the river's momentum instead of fighting it. He survived, battered, half-drowned, but alive. David Benson didn't make it. He was a photographer, a journalist. He'd been documenting the fishing trip. When Grigg yelled to jump, Benson was holding his camera. The wall of water hit the island before he could move. His body was recovered days later. Miles downstream, his camera was found too. Investigators developed the film. The last photograph showed the wall of water approaching, 30 feet high, filling the canyon, seconds away. Benson had been trying to document it, to capture the moment. The journalist's instinct to record what was happening. It cost him everything. 2 fishermen on an island. One jumped, one hesitated. One lived, one died. The margin measured in seconds. At Sugar City, 7 miles downstream, the wall of water arrived at 12:45 p.m., 45 minutes after the breach. It wasn't a wave. It was a moving flood, a surge of water 4 to 6 feet high, carrying everything: trees, cars, buildings, oil tanks, livestock. The water was moving at approximately 15 miles per hour through the town, faster than a person could run, faster than many vehicles could navigate through the debris. Most people had already evacuated, but not everyone. Clarence and Florence Daw were in their home when the water hit. Both in their 70s, they heard the warning. They tried to leave. The water caught them before they could get out. Their bodies were found 3 days later, 200 yards from their home. The house was gone, completely destroyed. Nothing but the foundation remained. Glenn and James Bedford, father and son, were trying to save livestock when the water arrived. Working to move cattle to higher ground, the water swept them away. Bodies recovered 5 days later, 4 miles downstream. Mary Jones Gillette refused to leave her home. Elderly, didn't believe it could reach her. The water proved her wrong. John W. Hayrand was trying to move his tractor to safety. The water caught him before he could get it started. And 6 others. 6 other people who heard the warning but misjudged the speed, misjudged the height, misjudged the power of 80 billion gallons of water that had been held back by fractured volcanic rock and under-compacted fill. 11 people total. Kent Marler would later say if this had happened in the middle of the night, or if it had happened in the middle of January, our loss of life would have been just terrible. There really would have been no way to prevent that kind of thing. Hundreds dead, maybe thousands. The flood continued downstream, through Rexburg, through Roberts, through Idaho Falls. The water spread across the Snake River Plain, a flood zone up to 10 miles wide in some areas. Dale Howard watched from high ground as the water hit the power plant below the dam. Later, he would describe what he saw to Time magazine, what stayed with him, what he couldn't forget. The power plant just disintegrated. Not collapsed, not damaged, disintegrated. The water picked up a huge oil tank, massive, industrial, thousands of pounds, picked it up like a cork, and away it went, tumbling downstream in the current. There was a beautiful grove of cottonwood trees down below, mature trees, 80 feet tall, trunks 3 feet in diameter, trees that had stood for 100 years. They were snapped off, like matchsticks. Not uprooted, snapped. The trunks breaking like twigs, the massive trees mowed down in seconds. That's the image that haunted Howard, not the dam breaking. Not the buildings washing away. The cottonwood trees, 80-foot giants, snapped like matchsticks. By 1 p.m., the breach was 400 feet wide, nearly the entire height of the dam. The reservoir was draining through the massive gap. 80 billion gallons finding their way to the Snake River. The erosion slowed as the water level dropped. Less pressure, less flow. The breach stabilized at approximately 450 feet wide. By evening, the reservoir was nearly empty. 80 billion gallons discharged in less than 6 hours. The dam was gone. Just the abutments remained. A massive V-shaped notch carved through the embankment. Foundation exposed. The fractured rhyolite bedrock visible. The voids, the channels. The geological nightmare that the geologists had warned about. All of it laid bare for investigation. And the investigation would prove every single warning correct. The flood had destroyed or damaged 771 homes, 191 businesses, 16 bridges, hundreds of miles of irrigation canals and roads, 16,000 head of livestock drowned. Cattle, horses, sheep, pigs. their bodies scattered across the floodplain. 13,000 acres of topsoil stripped from farmland. The fertile valley turned into a moonscape. Gravel, boulders, debris. The Yellowstone cutthroat trout population was devastated. The fishery the environmental groups had fought to protect was gone, buried under sediment, scoured by the flood. Riparian zones along the Teton River were washed away. Cottonwood trees that had stood for 100 years were now matchsticks scattered across the valley. 200 landslides were triggered in the reservoir area as the water level dropped rapidly. Slopes that had been stable underwater became unstable when exposed. The total damage exceeded $322 million, more than 3 times the construction cost. But the real cost wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in vindication. Every geologist who had warned about the site was proven right. Every concern they raised was validated. Every prediction they made came true. The independent review panel assembled after the failure included some of the nation's top engineering and geology experts. Their investigation was exhaustive, comprehensive, brutal. The findings were released in December 1976. Foundation problems. The rhyolite bedrock was highly fractured and jointed, creating a complex system of interconnected voids and channels. The grouting program, while extensive, was insufficient to create an impermeable barrier through this rock mass. Fill material problems. The wind-blown silt used for the core material was susceptible to internal erosion. When compacted at below optimum moisture content and below specified density, it contained interconnected void spaces that allowed water migration. Once water began moving through these voids, erosion accelerated rapidly through a process called piping. The failure mechanism. Water infiltrated the foundation through the fractured rock on the right abutment. This water then moved into the core material through the contact zone between the embankment and the bedrock. The water created a pipe through the undercompacted silt. This pipe grew through erosion until it reached the downstream face. Once the pipe breached the downstream face, catastrophic erosion began. The pipe enlarged rapidly, working both downstream and upstream, until the entire cross-section of the dam was eroded away. The timeline from first breach to complete failure, approximately 3 hours. The speed of erosion through the embankment, unprecedented in documented dam failures. The panel's conclusions were unequivocal. The site was fundamentally unsuitable for an earth-fill dam. The fractured bedrock and the fine-grained fill material created a combination that made catastrophic failure nearly inevitable during first fill. Better site selection would have prevented the disaster entirely. Every geologist who examined the site had said exactly that, before construction began, while they could still stop it, when their warnings could have prevented everything. Robert Curry of the University of Montana. Marshall Corbett of Idaho State University. David Schleicher of the USGS. Every single one of them vindicated. Every single one of them proven right. And they would have traded that vindication in a heartbeat to have been wrong. Because being right about a disaster doesn't feel like winning. It feels like watching a train wreck in slow motion. It feels like screaming into the void, while politicians smile for cameras at ribbon-cutting ceremonies. David Schleicher wrote his prophecy in December 1972, while the dam was still under construction. His exact words about setting up cameras to document the failure. They didn't set up cameras, but the failure was documented anyway, in 11 deaths, in 16,000 drowned livestock, in 771 destroyed homes, in $322 million in claims. The documentation was written in topsoil stripped from farmland. In Yellowstone, cutthroat trout populations devastated. In riparian zones, washed away. In 200 landslides triggered by the draining reservoir. And in Jay Calderwood's memory of backing up that bulldozer, watching the dam die beneath him, knowing he had seconds to beat 80 billion gallons. The lessons from Teton are taught in every civil engineering program in America. When you study geotechnical engineering, you study Teton. When you study engineering ethics, you study Teton. When you study the importance of independent review, you study Teton. The case demonstrates the critical importance of engineering geology for evaluation of foundation and borrow materials. Both the rhyolite under the dam and the fine aeolian silt used as fill material were deficient. Better borrow material was available in the valley downstream from the dam site, but the Bureau decided that using it would be environmentally disruptive. Read that again. They used inferior fill material to avoid environmental disruption. Then, the dam failed and caused the largest environmental disaster in Idaho history. The importance of compacting fill materials to maximum density at or near optimum moisture content. The material was too dry and not sufficiently compacted. The responsibility of independent review, using redundant measures to ensure safety. External peer review, independent voices who can say no. Had the first filling been managed using a low-level outlet works, the volume of water suddenly released could have been reduced. 24-hour monitoring of the dam and reservoir during its first filling may have contributed to lessening downstream consequences. But those are technical fixes. Those are engineering solutions. The real lesson is about listening. When every geologist says no, and politicians say yes anyway, physics gets the final vote. When experts warn you about unmeasurable voids in fractured volcanic rock, and you fill them with concrete and keep building, you're not solving the problem. You're postponing the catastrophe. When a government geologist writes that failure can be anticipated and suggests filming it, that's not academic speculation. That's prophecy. Jay Calderwood survived because he saw the signs and acted immediately. 3 minutes, that's all he had. But it was enough because he didn't wait for official confirmation. He didn't wait for authorization. He saw the geyser and he moved. Kent Marler saved hundreds of lives because he understood what could be anticipated meant. He didn't wait for the Bureau of Reclamation to declare an emergency. He sounded the alarm when the dam was still standing, when people still had time. Today, over 92,000 dams in the United States are monitored under protocols born from this disaster. Engineers review designs independently. Geological surveys have veto power. Congress can't pressure away seismic activity or fractured bedrock. The rules changed. But the rules changed because of what happened on June 5, 1976. That's the cost of pork barrel politics. That's the price of ignoring geologists. That's what happens when you find a void 18 inches wide, 20 feet long, of undetermined depth, and you fill it with concrete and keep building. The dam was never rebuilt. The ruins remain. A monument in fractured volcanic rock. A reminder that physics doesn't negotiate. And every civil engineering student in America studies those ruins and learns the same lesson. When supervisors say, keep working, and the dam is leaking, sometimes the right answer is to put that bulldozer in reverse and get the hell out. Jay Calderwood did that. He backed up. 3 minutes. Cat versus 80 billion gallons. The cat won. 2 other operators needed ropes, but they made it. Darryl Grigg jumped in the river. David Benson hesitated, One lived, one died. Seconds. A pregnant mother dropped her laundry, grabbed her daughter, made it to high ground. Minutes. Kent Marler ignored protocol, sounded the alarm, saved thousands. Because when physics starts speaking, the only winning move is to act first. Jake Calderwood moved first. He backed up that bulldozer, 165 feet above a geyser that was dissolving the toe of the dam. The cat versus the water. The cat won. Barely. But barely is enough.